Thanks to a robust economic recovery, many expect to see more growth in state revenue. But if you look beyond the short term, there's also a need to be cautious and to replenish the state stabilization fund. That's the outlook from the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. To talk about the revenue forecast is the foundation's president, Eileen McAnneny. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Things seem to be going wonderful as far as job creation, revenues coming in. So what is there to worry about?
Well, you're absolutely right. There are lots of positive signs. Certainly, job growth is one of them. But what we're a little concerned about is that long term, certainly, we might not see that job growth because of demographics. Massachusetts is aging, and as the baby boomers retire, there will be fewer people to fill those jobs. So that's one of the concerns, that we might not be able to see that robust growth, we believe, starting in 2017 because of demographics.
Another thing that's interesting here is that during all those down years, we had to draw from what we call the rainy day fund or stabilization fund. How does that look right now?
Well, so the rainy day fund needs to be replenished, no question about it. In fact, we issued a report recently that says that. So our concern is that we're in a time of economic recovery, as we just indicated. So we really should be building it up. And yet we haven't been in recent years. And so that leaves us not as well positioned as we would like for the inevitable next economic downturn. So we made a couple of recommendations. One, we think that any money in excess, any capital gains revenue in excess of a statutory threshold should be put into the rainy day fund, that we make sure that we replenish it, and that we build it up to about 10% of state tax revenues, because Massachusetts relies on income tax and capital gains, so we're more volatile than some other states as far as revenue sources, and we need to make sure we have a good reserve.
What about the actual tax burden? Because actually that's lightening up a bit too.
Well, the income tax is about to go down. Certainly in January, it will go down by a half a percentage point, which is great, and inevitably, or eventually rather, it will get down to 5%. And that was after the voters voted for that in a ballot initiative in 2000. So we've been gradually ramping that down.
What about pressures for spending? We're not even necessarily talking about new programs. We're talking about, it could be healthcare costs, transportation. Do you see some enormous pressures that you have to look at carefully?
There are. Certainly, there's always demands for the revenue that we bring in. And I think it's important to point out, so revenues are growing. They're expected to grow about $1 billion year over year for fiscal year 17. So that's good news, certainly. But there are lots of pressures, and there are lots of ways for us to spend that revenue, and some of it's required. Things like paying for pensions or debt service, that money comes off the top. And then you look at the Mass Health Program or Medicaid in Massachusetts, and that's growing at a faster clip than revenue growth. So that's taking up more and more of the budget. So, and then we look at healthcare in general, that's certainly increasing at a rate that some would say is unsustainable. So you take that all into consideration, and that's why we're concerned about the revenue long term.
Well, the governor has just made some cuts in the middle of the fiscal year, and it does not seem to be an especially alarming fiscal year, but they said these kinds of cuts are a little unusual.
They certainly are, and for a few reasons. One, it was a relatively small cut, so it was $50 million in cuts and then $50 million in new revenues for a total of about a little over $100 million, which is great, and that partially takes care of the deficit that he's projecting, not all the way. I think it's more signaling to the legislature that fiscal year 17 is going to be another tight year, and so everyone has to get into that tight belting mode.
Well,
or belt tightening mode.
Yes, coming back to another one of the topics that you've looked at over the past year, and that's the MBTA. If anything, the cost of fixing things is even higher than we thought it was before. But what about matching that with revenue? What about looking for savings?
So I think we're early in the process. We issued a report last March. I think I was in here and we talked about it. And since that time, there has been the establishment of the Fiscal Management and Control Board, and they're really looking at the T from stem to stern and trying to find out the size of the problem, which is the first critical step that we need to do. And you see in the media every day, they're uncovering more and more of the issues. The latest has been absenteeism and unexcused absences. And so we're seeing that, and they're really looking at procurement, all aspects of management. And there will have to be some tough choices in the year ahead. But I think it's important first that we get the size and scope of the problem, and that work is underway. But we will definitely have to have a conversation about revenues for the MBTA and for transportation more generally, at least with respect to the capital investments that are necessary. Some people might argue, more might be needed for the operating budget. For the mass taxpayers, we would say they're two separate issues, but the capital investment is going to be a critical need going forward.
What lessons have you drawn from the problems with the Green Line extension? Because if there's any new project in the future, I guess there are some things they have to avoid doing all over again.
They absolutely do. And I think having a better sense of the cost is certainly one basic issue. Making sure, and I think that, a lot of the stations, as I understand them, would be state of the art, which is wonderful. I'm not sure we can afford that, though. So just making sure we have a better sense of what we can afford and weighing in all of the costs. So in addition to building the stations, having more people that will man those stations, fix the tracks, all of the ancillary and ongoing costs that go along with building that extension is really critically important and needs to be factored in. And I'm not sure it was in the way that it needed to be.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
From the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, Eileen McAnneny. Still to come, we'll talk about a finding of discrimination in treatment of a Boston police recruit. But first, this message.